breakfast puppies?
This podcast contains adult language and content and is meant for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
The Glitterbois is listening to you are, yes.
Folks, I'm not necessarily feeling safe. We're sitting down to record another podcast of our podcast about Palladium. An NPC literally just in front of me with no advance warning pulled out the box set for Dying Earth. Where is this going?
I want to cast Lutar Brass Nose's 12-fold bounty.
I'm scared.
Okay. Today we're talking about various magic systems in role-playing games. And the reason I pulled out a copy of one of the many components of the fairly recent Dungeon Crawl Classics Kickstarter edition of the Dying Earth role-playing game is because, well, RPGs mostly stem from D&D. D&D used Vancian magic. Vancian magic comes 100% from the Dying Earth series. Well, yeah, I guess you would call it a series.
Yeah.
Short stories and a few novellas by Jack Vance. The late Jack Vance. It was a whimsical setting of a far, far, far future Earth where the sun is decaying and the Earth is dying and all these varied cultures across the world. And magic was just mercurial and weird. And they had spells such as Fandaw's Critique of the Chill, Hular's Visceral Pang, the Spell of Soft Silence, Arnold's Sequestrious Digitalia. What do these do? I don't fucking know.
You say Arnold's Sequestrious Digitalia, and with my... Oh my God. Arnold Schwarzenegger separating his fingers is all I can picture.
See? Okay, so Vancian magic comes from Jack Vance's Dying Earth setting. The wizards had to wake up in the morning, look through their librum of magical powers, figure out which ones they wanted to store in their brains, and later in the day, they would release those spells into the world. They didn't cast them so much as let them free to do their thing, because spells were, again, mercurial, whimsical things. And of course, when Dungeons and Dragons comes out, the hit role-playing game of the late 70s, magic worked that exact same way. And from ever since, we have referred to D&D magic, or at least classic D&D magic, as Vancian. So, Jacob, can you describe the basic mechanic of Vancian magic?
Well, I mean, you did a great job. The underlying conceit is that it is a formula that a wizard basically constructs in their own mind up until the point where going any further would bring the effect.
So they basically precast spells.
Right.
And then save like the last few words or utterances or motions to release it into the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, and depending on a wizard's level of experience, potentially level of power, how many of those chained animals, is how I kind of like to think about them, that they have rattling around in their skull varies, and the power of those spells. Having read a lot of fantasy fiction earlier in my life before I just burned out on fantasy fiction, Vancian magic and people who took from Vancian magic are one of my ones that I hold near and dear to my heart because of that conceit, where It's something that I honestly think that a lot of role-playing games don't do well. The fact that a wizard in many ways is wrestling to the ground this concept that is chaotic and is wanting to bring into creation all of this power, energy, things, whatever, and forcing it along one direction via formula and stuff is something that I feel very few role-playing systems, other than in the background color of the rule book, really capture.
Yeah, I agree. It's I've seen many role-playing games that more or less clone or slightly tweak Vancian magic, or even D&D today.
Mm-hmm.
It still basically uses Vancian magic for its wizards.
Mm-hmm.
They've changed certain things. They've reskinned things as spell slots now and made them a little more versatile, but it's still Vancian magic in its raw. If you strip out all the stuff that they've tacked onto it, it's Vancian.
And then added tiefling sorcerers.
Well, we'll get to sorcerers in a bit.
Yeah.
Sorcerers are a different beast.
Yep.
There is one game that comes to mind that I sometimes go back and forth on whether or not I think it's Vancian, but it shares many aspects of it in its own unique incarnation. And that is the old Earth Dawn role-playing game. And in it, wizard or magicians wove threads of power through reality. They basically connected points as they're casting a spell. They're weaving it. And in order to cast a spell that was pure, because of the way that the demon horrors had corrupted the world and the background radiation of magic or whatever, they made these little cat's cradle like power matrices, and they would pre-weave the threads of a spell into it so that they could pull it out and attach the last few strands and then cast it. It's more or less the same concept, though. Yeah. Just has a little physical component to it.
Very much so. Sometimes, I'm trying to remember the author, but he wrote a couple novels, and it's not L. Sprague de Camp, even though I wanted to say that, and that's wrong. That was what I've oftentimes considered anti-Vancian magic, where part of the conceit of a Vancian magic is that it really can't do anything until that last step. And this author wrote a series of books where the conceit was the only thing holding the spell back was literally the will of the caster. And so killing a wizard who has spells in their head could be a very dangerous thing.
Yeah. So Vancian magic as a game mechanic, I mean, it has withstood the test of time.
Yeah.
For its flaws that people perceive, it is still around because maybe that's because some believe it works, or maybe it's simply because it's one of those sacred icons of D&D that people are just like, it has to be there. We got to have armor class. We got to have hit points. We got to have Vancian magic kind of thing. So it's got its pros and its cons. I think that I'm going to start with some of the cons that I perceive. One is that it's complicated for new players. You read books of wizardry and adventure. You read Harry Potter. You read anything. You read Lord of the Rings. You're like, I want to be a wizard. I'm going to play this game. Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. And there's wizards in it. Great. I'm going to play a wizard. And the GM's like, all right, cool. Let's pick your spells. Now prepare your spells. And you're like, oh. And it requires the player to have a deeper knowledge of those powers so that they can build and prepare for everything. It is something that you don't just sit down and play a wizard in old school D&D unless you've already played a wizard in old school D&D. So that itself is a strike against it. But I think that an unusual point in its favor is something that a lot of people I don't think understand or appreciate about it. So one of the complaints that people have about old school D&D is that wizards rule everything. So if you have a group of characters, your fighter's going to rule the first few levels, and by the end, the wizard rules everything. They're just unstoppable, too powerful. GMs just don't know what to do. Can't handle it. Can't do it. Whatever. Oh, God, they're too powerful. Fantasy and Magic is your friend, Game Master.
Yeah.
That's what it's there for. It is a balancer. That wizard is not all powerful if they lose their spell book.
Right.
If they lose their spell book, they can't prepare their spells. And so, oh no, how dare you threaten a player's spell book? That takes away their power. It is a core balancing feature of the class. That's why it's even written in the game. The book exists for the sole purpose of being threatened. That's why there are so many spells out there to protect your shit. And I think it's brilliant. It is a brilliant balancing mechanic that so few GMs I've met are actually willing to go there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've never had a problem with that, but I'm a bastard GM from what my players tell me. You know, nuking the spell book is step one.
Yep.
You know, steal it, burn it, whatever. Flip side of that is the wizard protects it. The flip side of that is that as spells tend to get more powerful, the time to, especially if you go back to earlier versions of Dungeons and Dragons, the time to memorize them, to get them out of the spell book into your head, or the time to cast them tends to increase. Yeah, a wizard rolling around with a wish spell on tap is really freaking powerful. Go look at how long prior to 3rd edition it took said wizard to memorize that frickin' spell in the first place.
There were so many balancers in place that I think that Vancian is today, people scoff at it. They look back at the old ways of Vancian and remembering which spells and whatnot, but it was specifically there as a balancer that unfortunately people just kind of forget about.
Other systems of magic also bring the same thing where at quote unquote higher levels, a wizard definitely tips it in their favor, but adds other counterbalances. Like if you take Liguinian Earthsea magic, fucking up an Earthsea spell is got some major repercussions for the mage and potentially anybody within a 15-foot radius.
Yeah, I personally believe that any good fantasy fiction with magic should have deep consequences for the failure of said magic. Like just the whole willy-nilly using of magic without restraint is something that I always kind of roll my eyes at when I read it in fantasy.
Dungeons and Dragons, towards the end of 2nd edition, put out a series of books to modify the rule system. And Skills and Powers, there was a couple others, let you chop up character classes in real fun ways. Honestly, one of my favorite periods in the history of Dungeons and Dragons.
I also loved those books. They were maligned for some reason. I don't get it. Yeah, I loved them.
But chaos magic out of that.
Wild magic.
Yes. That's right. It wasn't chaos magic. It was wild magic. Where, while it was thought of as a one particular class of magic user to a certain extent, I actually ran several settings using every magic user who's not a cleric is a wild magic user, and every spell has backfire consequences and stuff like that. And I really, really liked that.
Wild magic was really fun. Oh God, it was a few years ago when I was running a 5e campaign, but I brought in a whole lot of it was originally a 2e campaign that I converted to 5e, but I still carried a lot of some of the 2e mentalities and systems forward. And one of them was wild magic, but I didn't use the super limited basic systems of wild magic I found online. a D10,000 table of wild magic effects. They were glorious. Glorious. Yeah. So something else that came out, this is a good segue though. In those same books, I remember they introduced spell points.
Yes.
Okay, I might be misremembering that. It might have been in the DMG, but I think it was in the skills and powers.
I believe you're right on that. I'm gonna back you up. Although that's an idea that had been kicking around prior to when those books came out, because I remember a couple articles in Old Dragon magazine that played with the same concept.
Yeah.
So it was something that was in the conversation, but I think the first time it ever appeared in an official TSR Dungeons and Dragons book was that, but
Could have been. Spell points was essentially instead of your slots, you as a spellcaster got a certain number of points that you got more every time you leveled up. I think you got points equal to your current level. Could be wrong, but I think that's what it was. And to cast the spell, it took a number of points equal to the level of the spell. Very simple math. I played with that before and it worked. That was essentially proto-sorcery. And then, of course, Third Ed comes along and introduces the sorcerer. But the spell points, it worked. Right. And Palladium did it as well.
Palladium did it before.
Palladium actually did it without calling it that in an interesting way. So the Palladium fantasy role-playing game has four interesting systems of magic. You have spell casting, such as the warlocks, the wizards, the witches, and whatnot, the priests who all cast from the same pool. You have psionics, which is the first spell points, I believe, at least for Palladium, were the psionics ISP. They're basically spell points.
Yep.
But then you also had those wonderfully intricate runes, wards, and circles from the Summoner and the Diabolist. That's a whole other conversation. But Palladium ditched Vancian entirely and instead gave two different methods of spell points. They had one, the basic magic one, which is just spells per day. I guess that's kind of spell points. You have X spell point, and every spell costs 1 point. Those are spell points. That's essentially it. Wizards, priests, anybody in old school Palladium who could cast spells, they didn't have you can cast at level 3, you can cast 3 level 1 spells and 1 level 2 spell every day. It was like, no, you have X number of spells you can cast per day from any of the spells you know. Beautiful. It's wonderful. Super easy to take care of. And it made it so that new players could sit down and play a wizard, and they didn't have to read over lengthy tomes of comparing what all these spells do. They could just pick it when they cast it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, very much so. Didn't they move to a point system though in PC?
Eventually they would.
We should talk about
that. They took away the hybrid multiple systems of spell points. The spells per day versus the magic points or the ISPs of psionic magic. Because in First Ed, psionics were just different magic.
Yeah.
More or less. That's mechanically how they worked.
Literally called the Mind Mage.
Yep. And it's in the Men of Magic section. But later they would go to the PPE system, which exactly the same as ISP. It's basically ISP for spells. And they didn't fucking hold back. You could have spells that cost as little as 2 or 4 PPE, and then later spells that cost thousands.
Yes.
And you don't get thousands. You gotta find other sources of power to cast those spells. And they're usually pretty messed up. So once again, I attest, Palladium's pretty metal.
Yes. So, what is your... So, Palladium Fantasy... no, I won't even restrict it to Palladium Fantasy. What's your favorite magic using OCC?
Oh, my God. Oh, God, there's so many. I was obsessed with line walkers when I first got into Rifts. they just look so cool. But I remember being that young reader, first time holding a Rift's book in my hand and reading that they had that ley line drifting power. And that was the one. I can just fucking float all day down this glowing highway. That's cool. So I do love me some line walkers. And then they brought that back into fantasy and gave it to wizards and stuff. But my favorite magicians are the summoners and diabolists, personally. Yeah.
Yep.
They have no immediate power.
Nope.
Whatsoever. But they are great long-term gatherers of power. Yeah.
I very much agree with you. Like I've mentioned in the past, one of Fantasy was probably the second system from the Palladium lineup that I had exposure to. And the other ones did not have magic elements prior to that. So it wasn't really a thing, unless you want to count chi. And when I got to Fantasy, it was like summoners and diabolists were just, I loved the concept that more ritualistic approach to magic, someone actually pulling that off in a role-playing game and having it feel right was awesome.
Someone publishing a role-playing game full of satanic circles and symbols in the middle of the satanic panic. And getting away with it, that's pretty awesome.
As a survivor of the satanic panic, we're both survivors of the satanic panic, but yeah, I mean, like, oh my God. I had a friend who ended up having their first edition Palladium fantasy book burnt by their mother over that.
Yeah. So that doesn't even go into other magic systems, though, that we have actually not, I don't think, seen in Palladium. Other games, there's the, what do you call it? The ad-lib combinative magic systems of things like Ars Magica, Mage, 4th edition Talislanta, other things that have, instead of raw spells, they have examples, they're there, but instead of like lists of spells, they're like, this is your power of motion, this is your power of intention, this is things, and you have to combine these sources to create effects. That's pretty cool stuff, but it requires a player who is on point with their improv.
Oh yeah. As someone who GM'd more than a little bit of Mage the Ascension and Ars Magica, yeah, it's a lot on both the player side and the GM side.
Yeah. There's a lot. You have to be ready to stop and think. Yep. Okay, give me a minute. No, give me a minute. Yep. I'm pushing things together because it requires a lot of investment in creative use of what's on your sheet. I would say above and beyond inventory lists and spell lists. Yeah.
If you're interested in going down that road, I'd recommend taking a look at Ars Magica first before you take a look at Mage the Ascension, because going in to Mage the Ascension first, that way lies madness. Ars Magica has a more approachable approach to the concept. More approachable approach. Great language, Jacob. Its approach is more kind to someone who hasn't ever really dealt with the concept before. Mage is kind of like, there's the deep end, jump in, have a nice night. It's in the later books that will tell you about rotes, which are the quick and dirty stuff that, is kind of the pre-programmed spells. And, oh, by the way, every other mage will look down on you for doing that. Those are for trainees.
Then there's the Shadowrun magic system, which you know a bunch of spells, and whenever you cast them, you essentially can cast an infinite number of spells all day long, provided you can resist the drain.
Right.
Which is as if let's say you have 20 spells that you want to cast, but you only have 10 magic points. And those 10 magic points are your health. And you don't want to spend those magic points. That's what Shadowrun Drain is like.
One of the things I always appreciated about the Shadowrun system was, even though it didn't quite work this way, the concept of overcasting,
Mm-hmm.
where
Oh yeah, you basically all spells they're just blank, they're just basic,
yeah,
and then you determine the level when you cast it.
right. And if you go beyond your skill at casting a spell, is you got to remember Shadowrun had the 2 health tracks. It had the
Will or physical and stun.
physical and
Yeah.
stun. And as long as you were playing around with magic relative to your level of casting ability and such,
Mm-hmm.
it went off the stun track. But if you crank that shit to 11, you were putting your life in danger. You weren't
Yeah.
just going to pass out. You were going to potentially, die of a hemorrhage.
Yep. Shadowrun's a lot of fun. It's also super crunchy.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, other magic systems that come to mind that I was listing off before we did this, again, going back to Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is what we started talking about with this Dying Earth book. Dungeon Crawl Classics actually doesn't use Vancian magic at its core. It seems to. It does something that has a spiritual feeling similar to Vancian, but essentially you can actually just keep casting all day long.
Mhm.
You have to succeed at your casting roll. And if you don't, then you can potentially lose control of the spell, a little bit of wild magic there, or corrupt yourself, burning away your life or gaining mutations or something. It's very interesting. And each spell in Dungeon Crawl Classics, every single spell has its own lengthy random roll table. It's why when people look at DCC, the core book, and how thick it is, you can like stop bullets with it. I like to tell them half or more of that is spell lists.
Yep.
It's not a dense system.
Nope.
Yep.
And I mean, there's other magic systems out there.
Mhm.
The Call of Cthulhu system, which is vaguely Vancian.
Mm-hmm.
Its penalties for magic use are on the back end rather than the front end. The spell itself probably has some effects you may not care for.
Yeah.
The very fact of learning the spell may drive you insane. There's that sort of thing. There's other ones out there. RuneQuest had an interesting one that it was similar lines. They've tweaked it with different editions, but a couple of them somewhat interesting. There's been a couple PowerPoint versions of it and some other stuff. Definitely more ritualistic than several other systems we've discussed. Oh God.
I would make a note. One of the key things about Vancian magic that I haven't mentioned yet, and one key mechanical component of it that Palladium has in common, despite not having the memorization and the spell slot kind of thing, Palladium has one key component in common with Vancian magic, and that is you don't roll to cast the spell. You cast the spell. That's it.
Yep.
When you say you cast the spell happens. Now, some might say roll then to hit the target with your spell, but there's no magic roll. There's no spell casting roll. You and Palladium don't have a spell casting skill. You have the spell, you cast the spell, that's it. That is a core component of Vancian that actually I do like it, because that means I can be confident that my spell is going to happen the way it says in the book.
Yeah, and God, I'm trying to remember. This is driving me nuts. There's been a couple other magic systems like that have appeared in literature that I've always wanted to see hit the role-playing game space. And
people are coming up with new systems all the time these days. It seems
Yeah.
like any new fantasy author that wants to make it big, they feel like they have to reinvent the magic wheel.
Yeah.
And I can appreciate it.
Yeah.
If
I
it's
can
clever, but oftentimes it's just like they take Vancian and they take something and they tweak one thing and it's brand new.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. It's one of those things where magic is such a defining element of any fantasy or setting that has a fantasy-ish component to it that everybody tries to find a way to make it work mechanically and still give it its own flavor. And it always seems like there's this inherent challenge that is something that's easy for a player, especially a new player, to approach, but still gives the zip of difference. And that's why I think we see so many takes on Vancian magic, because in many ways, Vancian is somewhat mechanistically the easiest to approach.
Yeah. Yes. Mechanically, it's very simple to pull off. Again, though, you got to know those spells going into it,
right,
especially if it's one that makes you prepare the spells.
Right.
That's the biggest, I think, the biggest holdback into getting new players to actually enjoy playing magicians, which is why the sorcerers, which were essentially limited spell power but versatile slots.
Mm-hmm.
Palladium was already doing that with wizards, by the way, in first ed.
Yep.
But why the sorcerers are so popular and gained like so much popularity among the player base when they came out, because suddenly new players could sit down at the table and be like, I have 3 powers. I can use them 7 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm good. I'm golden. It changed everything.
Yeah. Yep. God, I'm thinking back to all of the late 70s RPGs I've thumbed through.
Oh God, I've got a Christian role-playing game that in order to cast spells, you recite Bible verse.
At the table.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
There's a Korean, there's an American game based on Korean language where in order to cast spells, you learn the Korean language. It's called Magicians, the language role-playing game. There's lots of clever takes. I remember Thieves World for 3rd ed D&D.
Oh, yeah.
Had a mana system where you didn't have any spell power yourself. You had to draw it to you. Mm-hmm. So every round you're drawing mana, and then you can release your spells once you have enough mana. And again, it's really all just goes back to simple magic systems that we've known for years that people are applying one clever little tweak to here and there to make it seem new.
Yeah. Like there was a conversation going on in our Discord just the other day about Fated Suns, the D&D setting, which...
Dark Sun.
Why did I say Fated Sun? Jeez.
I think because we were talking about Fading Suns on our Dune. Yeah.
But Dark Suns, it's still technically Vancian magic because it's D&D magic, but it has one of the better differentiators to it. I mean, when I say better, I'm not saying what I'm trying to get at. It's easier to implement the differentiator for that magic at the table than many other RPG systems where if you're trying to keep things fast, furious, fun, you end up shaving the edges, cutting corners on your magic system a lot. But with that version of magic, it's really, really pretty straightforward. I after the conversation in our Discord, I ended up pulling out my old books and flipping through it, which again, thank you for. I got them from you.
Oh man, you just reminded me of Savage Worlds when you said fast, furious, fun. I think Savage Worlds, oddly enough, despite me having loved that game for many years and run it for over a decade, Savage Worlds, I think, takes the worst aspects of things.
Oh, yeah.
Because not only do you have spell points, you also have to roll to cast the spell.
Yeah. So
you spend the spell point, and then you roll to cast the spell, and you could fail. So now you're out of spell points, and you failed the roll. It's... Oh God, I never ever even thought about that until just now. What a ripoff. It sucks to be a mage in that system.
Oh yeah, no, I never liked playing a mage in Savage Worlds under the basic rules. Some of the settings that played around with it, it's a bit of a different story. But this reminds me, I was talking about old role-playing games that I've gone through over the years that came out in the late 70s. There was one that had a magic... First of all, there was no levels to their spell list. This is the spell list. every spell cost a certain amount of magic points. It was an interesting system because you could ritualize just about any spell, and by taking a substantially longer time, like instead of 1 round, 1 hour, you could generate more points for that specific spell. But it also had a skill roll element to it. And if you succeeded well enough, it didn't cost you any points. And that was a novel one that I really liked. It was set in the Enlightenment period. It was a small publisher British role-playing game. I'm trying to remember what it was called, but John Dee was like a major character in
Okay.
So,
Dear listener, if you know this game, please drop our Discord and tell us. It sounds cool.
Its cover was blue and white. Almost looked like a mimeograph. If you can remember it, I would appreciate my memory being jogged.
Now that I think we're just like reaching, we're trying to find others. There's so many. But most of them, ultimately, I'll just trace it back to Jack Vance.
Yep.
He is the granddaddy of RPG magic.
Yep.
Yeah.
Him and Elsprog de Camp.
I've never read anything that the camp wrote except for the Conan pastiche stuff.
Yeah, I mean, his magic tends to be along the same lines of Vancian, but has a little bit of a different feel.
I'll have to check him out.
Yeah. And then, of course, I think we have to mention it just because you and I are talking about it. The magic from the Black Company universe.
Okay.
I love that inherent, very few, I haven't seen a game that did it well, but that inherent combination of both learned magic and off-the-cuff magic. Like, I'm just going to create a fireball in this teacup to practice to see if I'm getting my magic back. To the literally along the same line, artificer magic with the broomsticks and everything that they're running around on in the last books. You know, that's one that the Black Company setting for D&D 3.5 tried its hardest to make it work, but
it tried
really hard, and it did a relatively decent job with the limitations. But yeah, that was another one where there's a lot there.
Yeah, we'll have to come back to that.
Yeah,
I think we did a whole thing on Dune.
Yeah.
I think we could do a whole episode on the Black Company.
Oh, I mean, yeah. Yeah, you and I have chatted about that one before.
Okay, we are dragging this out. Let's wrap up.
Yeah, let's wrap up.
Magic, dear listener, do you like playing mages? And if so, what's your favorite magic system? And if specifically in Palladium, what's your favorite magic OCC?
Yeah, definitely.
Drop by our Discord and let us know. Join the conversation. Get our brains rolling in yet another direction to get more of these freeform discussions going.
Drop by our Discord. Join the conversation. We might even add a channel for the question of the podcast where we'll have discussions about these questions that we put forth. Because like almost every single podcast, we bring up a question for our dear listeners.
We do. This is a good idea.
Yeah, we should like a sub channel for the Glitterbois.
Note to self when editing this. Write that down.
Yeah.
Thanks, dude. Appreciate it. Okay. Well, that's it. Good night.
Starships, magic, mystic martial arts, romance. All of these can be found in A Cloak of Blades by Isaac Scher. You might have heard my name before. I've done a lot of voiceover work for Breakfast Puppies, and I've recently released my first novel. It's available on Amazon as an ebook and paperback, and you can get it for free if you have a Kindle Unlimited subscription. I do hope you'll support my work as you're supporting Breakfast Puppies, and it's been a pleasure talking with you today. Have a good one.
You've been listening to The Glitterbois, a Palladium Books fan podcast. Glitterbois, Rifts, the Megaverse, and all other such topics are the property of Kevin Siembieda and Palladium Books. Please buy all their stuff and help keep them in print and making more games. You can order directly at palladiumbooks.com, and their entire catalog is available digitally at Drive-Thru RPG as well. Our opening music is 8-Bit Bass and Lead by Furby Guy from freesound.org. This closing music is Caravana by Philip Gross, available at freemusicarchive.org. All sound effects used are self-made or acquired via Creative Commons Zero license. If you like what you have heard, find us on Twitter and Facebook as The Glitterbois. That's BOIS. And check us out online at breakfastpuppies.com/glitterboys. And also join us on the Breakfast Puppies Network Discord at breakfastpuppies.com/discord. And if you want to help us out, please spread the word and help us build a community. Thanks again for listening. We'll catch you next time.